So the next file that's in that group, so Vivian, if you look inside either the folder that you just grabbed or the one that you had from last week, there should be that Fall 22 composites. We're looking for this photograph that was done by David. It's a picture of that same girl in yellow, sort of in a snow cover. There's snow on the ground and a road that looks like it's been plowed. If you can double click to open this guy up. So what can you tell me about this image? If you see that guideline that's right in the middle, you can hide it by just hitting Command H. So what can you tell me about this image? I'm not sure it's backlit per se. There's definitely the sky that's behind her is but not backlit in that same sense that I'm getting that like glow around her. But you're on the right track. What else can you tell me about the lighting? It is not side light at all. It's a big general overcast heading towards twilight kind of time of day, right? So it's a big general light, which goes right back to what we have here. It's the wrong girl. So we're going to get rid of everything except for the background, just like we did before. So if you scroll down to the bottom of your layer stack and click on the first curve that's right above the background to make it active, and then scroll all the way to the very top of your layer stack, hold down the Shift key and click. It will select all of those layers, and then hit the delete key or the backspace if you're on Macintosh, and it will get rid of all of it. Again, we need to bring in the proper girl. The correct girl for this is in our Session 9 folder. So in your assignments, Session 9, inside the assignment folder, there is the girl in yellow and there's the girl in black. You want to double click on the girl that's in black because she's the one that's flat lit from the top. I'm going to hide the others. Again, if you're using tab behavior, you're going to have to tear your tabs apart so that you can see these two things side by side. Then you want to make sure that the girl image is active because we are going to drag the girl layer onto our scene. So simply click on it and drag it over onto the street scene. Hold down your Shift key and let go, and it will bring it into the center of your image. And then you can go ahead and close up the girl that we just opened up, and you should have both of the image elements together. Everybody good on this? Okay, so when I look at this right off the bat, I'm trying to find something in here that I feel like is scaled correctly, that would actually give me some sense of how big this girl should actually be. So there's a number of things. There's really only one thing that I see in here, and it's the stripe that's actually in the middle of the scene. So I need everyone to go to a web browser really quickly, and I need you to do a Google search for how wide is center line on a street. Yeah, but again, all of the machines that go to paint those things are all the same, so it's a pretty standard kind of thing. So how wide is a street stripe? And it says right here, normally 4 inches. All right. So did everybody sort of come up with that sort of similar answer? Okay, so we need to translate 4 inches to whatever's going on down here. So I'm going to leave her right where she is. We could scale her later, but I'm going to just show you guys the way that I actually do this part to get a legitimate reading. And I put away my pad of paper, so hang on one second. I got to pull that guy out again. So here's how you do it, the trick, the best way to do it. I like to set my rulers up to be in pixels because that way when I go to actually use an independent ruler, it will also be in pixels. It just makes the math easier. So if you hover over, if your rulers are not showing, so the rulers on the edges of your image, go to your view menu, come down and put a check mark right next to rulers and they will show. To change the increment unit that they use, hover your cursor over the ruler, hold down the Control or Command key, click, and you'll get a drop-down menu and you can pick any sort of unit of measure that you want. I'm going to pick pixels. It just makes, again, the math easier. To figure out what's right underneath the girl, I'm going to zoom in here. I'm going to actually grab her foot. I'm going to move her. So I'm going to hit the V key to move her. And I'm going to hold down the Shift key so that she will only go left or right. And I'm going to bring this across till her toe touches the area of that stripe. So just that way, it's just easier for me to know how wide this is. Then if you take a look at your toolbar on the right-hand side and you come down, it's the tool that I'm looking for is the eyedropper tool. But if you click on the eyedropper tool, you'll get a flyout menu and you can come down and see sort of right in the middle of that flyout box is the ruler tool. If you pick ruler tool and then come over and I'm going to click right on the edge of that stripe by her toe, I'm going to click and drag to the other side. And what I'm doing is I'm looking at my info palette up at the top, and you can see that the width is giving me a minus 122. The reason it's minus is only because I pulled it from right to left. If I went from left to right, that would be a positive number. It doesn't matter to me. It's the 122 that I'm looking for. Did that work for everybody? Did you guys get something close? Is anybody doing this measurement? Are we good? I get the feeling nobody's good. Do we need to go through this again, or are we okay? All right, so I get 122. So this is how you do the math. So I'm going to do this on screen so that you guys can actually see. I'm just going to bring up a new blank file, something that I can write on. So this is how you actually do the math. Hit the B key. Make this a hard brush. All the way up 100% opacity, 100% flow. So yeah, make it a little bit smaller. So this is how you do it. I'm going to put 122. That was the number of pixels that I have. And right across from that, 4, which stands for 4 inches. So that's, again, we did our research, and it said that this little stripe right here is 4 inches wide. So in my measurement, I've also got 122 pixels. Then you actually put a line here and a line here, and underneath this, on the side that's actually got the inches, we need to put how many inches the girl is. So the girl is 70 inches tall. She's 5'10". She might even be 6 feet tall, 72, because she's wearing heels. But I'm going to go ahead and leave this at 70 inches. And then what you do to come up with this value, what we're trying to find is how many pixels tall should the girl be. To do that, you cross multiply. So you do 122 times 70. And I'm going to whip out my calculator to do that. So what's the answer? 8,540. And then you divide that 8,540 by 4. So again, you multiply this times this and you divide it by 4. So can you divide that by 4 and tell me what you get? 3,100 what? Okay. 2,135, right? Okay, so that's how tall I need the girl to be. So I'm going to double click on the hand to figure out how tall she actually is. I'm going to come up to my ruler and I'm going to grab a guide and bring it down and stick it right underneath her foot. There's another guide that's already on here, which I don't want, so I'm going to hit the V key to get the move tool, and if I hover over this guide, I can actually drag it back up to the ruler to get rid of it. So I've got one guide that's right under her feet. I'm going to go back to my ruler now. I'm going to click on the guide at the bottom and drag up. I'm going to hold down the shift key so it goes straight up. And what I'm looking for again is my readout in my height of my info palette. And I'm looking to get 2,135. Isn't that what you just said? Okay, I'm close enough. I'm 2,133. I'm going to go ahead and say okay to that. And then I'm going to drag another guide down. That is how tall that girl should be in this space, in this scene, based on what's really in the scene. So to get her that scale, a girl is actually selected. Command T to actually bring up the transform dialog box. Click on the link between the width and the height. Drag your anchor point now, the thing that's right right near her crotch, down to the bottom of the bottom guideline, because now when we actually go to change her scale, she will shrink from the top down only. And then I'm simply going to come into a corner and I'm going to drag her down until the top of her head hits the top of that guy and hit OK. She is now scaled according to this sizing in here in space. And there's nothing else in here that we could have looked at to give us the true size of her when you bring it in. But looking at this now, it certainly looks a whole lot more believable than that did. Right? This, she would be on a walking path. This, she's actually on a street. Are there questions about how we did that? All right. To get rid of all of this, and we can get rid of all of this, simply come up to the View menu, come down to Guides, and do Clear Guides. It'll get rid of them. So now we actually need to, and I'm going to click on the Move tool. It'll just get rid of your ruler. So this part's actually working for me right now. I need to now run my check layers. However, before I do that, I have suspicions about this background. If you look at it, it is a smart object. If we double click on it, it will actually open up. And I do the same trick that I was doing before when we were trying to color balance things. Now, you could say, and if you look in the background, you can see it's sort of sunset is happening in the background. So it's a warmer glow that's actually happening in here. The problem that I have is the girl is not warmer. She is neutral. So even if I want this whole thing to be warmer, I want to neutralize this first, put it together in the composite with the girl, and then warm the entire composition up, if that's my goal in all of this. But right now, to take a background that is really warm and put it in with a girl that's neutral, you'll have a color imbalance, which I don't want. So I am going to white balance this. I'm going to click on the eyedropper that will give me my white balance, and I'm going to come over and I'm simply going to click on the snow. It doesn't change things much, but it changes them a little bit. I'm also going to click on the auto button at the top to see what it does in terms of my exposure. And you can see in my exposure, it brought in a little bit of tone in the sky, which I like. It brought out the area of the warmth that's in the back on the trees that are back in the back part. It brought up my contrast in here. It's just a much more lively image. If you click on the little icon just on right underneath the preview on the lower right-hand side, it'll give you your before and after, and you can see it's turning. This is not only changing all the exposure part that I did, it's also turning off the lens correction control and the chromatic aberration control. So this looks good to me right now, so I'm going to go ahead and say okay to that. And then I'm going to run my check layers. You see it really brought in some character to that sky. I really like that part of it all. So anyway, I'm going to now click on the girl to make her active because I want my check layers to be on top of her. And I'm going to go over to my actions palette and run my check layers action again. If you haven't changed anything in the stack, you can simply click on the button. It'll run the whole thing again. I'm going to turn off both the hue and hue saturation and the color check layer. And I'm going to start with my luminosity check layer control. So in this is another one of those situations where the contrast in the girl, if you imagine this scene, there's a lot of snow on the ground, There is a gigantic canopy of light overhead. It's a pretty flat scene in here. You don't really see a lot of deep shadow in here, but I've got a lot of deep shadow in her. So I'm just zooming in on her a little bit. That's too much. To sort of open her up. So I'm going to go down to my composite. I'm going to select her because remember, contrast control, we actually use shadows and highlight filter to actually lift those shadows. So I've selected the girl, up to the image menu, down to adjustments, down to shadows and highlights. So take a look at my screen if you don't know where I am. Image menu, adjustments, shadows and highlights. When you let go, again, by default, this thing opens up. It always opens up with an amount. It doesn't ever touch the highlights, but it opens up with the amount, a lift of 35% on the shadows. This looks overlit to me, so I'm going to pull this down. I'm going to grab the slider and start to drag it towards the left to start bringing some of that shadow part back into it. And again, I'm looking at her face. I'm looking at everything else in the scene. And when I get down to like a 12, 13, 15%, somewhere in there, it feels right to me. So I'm going to go ahead and say okay to that part. I'm going to turn off my luminosity check layer and see how I feel about that. And I actually feel like the girl now, I feel like we lightened things up in the shadows, but I feel like the girl herself is too bright for this scene. So my next move, again, I'm going to leave my luminosity check layer on. My next move, the girl is selected. I'm going to add an adjustment layer on top of this. So click on the icon at the bottom of your layers palette that's half circle, half black, half white. We're going to add a curve to this. Again, I'm going to change the blending mode of that curve from normal down to luminosity because that is what we're changing here. I'm also going to clip this curve down to the girl, so because I only want the curve to impact her. So either click on the little icon at the bottom of your layers of the properties panel, or just hold your cursor between the curve and the girl, hold down your option key. You'll get that icon of a square with a counterclockwise arrow. Click on that. It has now been clipped to the girl. So I actually need to make her darker, but again, I don't want the shadows that are already, I just lightened the shadows up. I need to make her highlights darker. That's what this is all about. So again, this is not a move that happens in these midtones. This is brightness. This is not exposure. And what I'm trying to deal with here really is more exposure. So you grab the white point that's at the top of that curve, click on it and start to bring it down. And you'll notice it actually makes her face is growing much darker without her coat actually getting significantly darker. So this seems more fitting to me when I look at this. If you turn the eyeball on and off, it looks more believable in this scene to me as a black and white image. I feel like this is more believable. I'm going to turn off my luminosity check layer, and again, I'm going to turn this thing on and off, and it brought it down into that kind of brightness that's actually believable in this scene. The color is still off and the saturation is still off, but I think the luminosity here is correct. Once we adjust the color and the saturation, I might revisit the luminosity. I might lift it up a little bit or pull it back down. I might open up the shadows a little bit more. I mean, this is sort of an iterative process. So I can only tell you that the way I always do it is starting with luminosity, which is basically exposure and contrast. Then I move to color, and then I finally end up with saturation. And then a lot of times I will come back and revisit the luminosity. So I'm sort of okay with where we're at right now. I'm going to turn on my two color check layers, the hue saturation and the color fill that are at the very top. And again, we're going back to this same standard classic problem with this. This is a coat and an outfit that is far too blue to be in these really warm scenes. So I'm going to scroll down. My curve that's controlling the luminosity is still selected. I'm now going to add another adjustment layer. So I'm going to click on the icon at the bottom, and we are going to add a color balance layer. I'm going to change the blending mode of that layer to color so that it only impacts the color. and I'm going to clip it to the body so that I only am controlling the color of the figure and not my scene. And then this has been pretty standard for us. I've got to raise the yellows in here to actually get them to drop back out. Once I get the yellows in there, I'm getting, like I said, this is pretty much similar to what we did before. I'm getting quite a bit of green in here, and I've got so much orange in here. So I'm going to grab my magenta green slider, and I'm going to pump in a little bit of magenta so that it's starting color-wise to match and blend what else is going on in the scene. And in my case, I ended up with a -18 in my yellow and a -6 in my magenta. I'm going to turn off my color check layers and see what that did. Sorry, those were not my color check layers. Those are my adjustment layers. Turn off the color check layers. And this is what my color move has now done. And my color move brings this so much more into this scene. This part actually is looking really pretty solid for me right now. So my final adjustment on here is going to be my saturation check layer. I'm going to click on that, and then you can see that the trees that are in the very back of this image are pretty highly saturated, but there's nothing else up where she is that is anywhere near as closely saturated. So I am going to drop the saturation on her a little bit. So I'm looking at the adjustment layers that I've used so far. I've got my luminosity one, I've got the color one above it. I'm going to add one more adjustment layer, which is going to be my hue saturation. And I'm going to change the blending mode of that to saturation only, so it only impacts the saturation. I am going to clip it to the other layers so that it only impacts the girl. And then I'm going to simply drop the saturation a little bit. I'm really primarily looking at her face. And I'm feeling like that seems to be fitting what's going on in this scene a little bit better, especially in the area around her. I'm going to then turn off my saturation check layer, double click on the hand, and without throwing in shadows so far, I mean, this girl absolutely fits this space, don't you think? I mean, this is crazy. Let's throw in one single shadow because nobody ever believes any of this stuff until they see a shadow. So I'm going to click on my background layer, hit the G key, add a blank layer above it, hit the G key to get the gradient tool. It's still defaulted, my foreground and background color. My foreground color still is black. I'm going to click to drag out a gradient, Command T to bring up the transform dialog box, hold down the Option key and crush that guy. Bring it down here that's underneath her. Slide it in a little bit more, crush it down so it's a little bit more of a disc. Slide it over a little bit. Go ahead and hit the Enter key to do that. Hit the E key to immediately get an eraser. Erase all the stuff that's on the sides of her that would never be there. You can, I still think that this is too wide. You can continue to transform, so I'm just going to hit Command T again. It brings me right back where I was. Hold down the Option key and compress this a little bit more. Say OK to that. Go ahead and then drop the opacity of this down considerably so it's a mere sort of shadow in there. And then again, I would put in the boots, the highlights under her boots. I would do all that kind of stuff, whatever. But this is where I'm at right now. Over to the history palette. Click and do a snapshot of my history. This is where it started. And this is where we are now. Again, from what I can tell here, it's hard to say. I think this girl was scaled a little bit wrong, but nonetheless. If we wanted to scale this girl up, we don't really have a horizon line. You can sort of imagine where a horizon line is. It's somewhere kind of like right behind her body. The problem is that I know the horizon line on her is much closer to her knees. So if I wanted to try to transform this and still have some sense of what the scale was, I would probably bring her up here to the area that we were going to do, and I would remeasure the width of the line up here where I put her, and then do that whole math calculation again to see how tall she should ultimately be. Any questions about this guy? You can close this up. You do not need to save that. We're going to go right on next to the next one, guys. So in the next one, Lillian's. So since Lily is right here, what can you tell me about the lighting? Yeah, so wrong girl again. All right. That's why I said when this whole thing first started out, I was just like, I can't believe it. There was only one person who ever got the right girl. So we're going to do the exact same thing that we've done here all along. I'm going to select the girl this time. She's right above the background. So make the girl layer active. Go all the way up to the top. Hold down your shift key and select the whatever layer's on the very top. Hit delete. We're going to start just with the Art Institute. I know this is the Art Institute. And we're going to bring in that same figure that we keep bringing in, not because I love it, but because that's actually, it's the girl that belongs in this scene. So, composite body number 2. I've just come up to my file menu down to open recent, and you'll have a running list of the files you've opened. We keep opening this composite body 2. That's the one that's the girl in here. I'm going to again click and drag the girl onto my scene, hold down the shift key so that she comes in. If you get a warning about mismatch, as long as we keep the colors consistent, that's all we care about, and by default that's how they set it up, so you can simply hit OK. And she comes in as giant girl. So right off the bat, before I do anything, I'm going to scale her to something that I know or that I'm guessing about. Again, she's a smart object, so scaling up and down and up and down and up and down are going to have no destructive impact on this at all. Command T to bring up the transform dialog box. Click on the link between width and height, and then I'm going to use the scrubby slider. I'm just going to hover over the H with my cursor. You'll get an arrow, a hand with an arrow pointing in 2 different directions. If you simply start to drag to the left, she gets smaller. I'm going to then click on her, the V key to get the move tool, and what I want to do is I want to position her right next to the stair banister and the stool that's right there. So I've got her sitting back on the whole stair banister stool part, but when I look at this, I think to myself, there's no way she's actually going to touch that banister. She's a giant woman right now. So zoomed in, I'm going to hit Command T again to continue to transform and make her smaller. Again, I'm clicking on the link between width and height. I'm going to drag, because her foot is right where I want it to be here. I'm looking at her, I'm putting her right next to this banister. So her foot is where it needs to be, so I'm going to drag the anchor point down to the bottom of the transform handle so that when I transform her body, she simply shrinks from the top down. If you leave the transform anchor in the middle and you do a transform, her feet will start to travel up and her head will everything starts to move towards the middle, which means you have to then reset it. It just takes longer to do. But this way I can crank it down until I get her and I feel like so. Everybody in the room, stand up. Where's a banister? If you reach out for a banister, so I'm walking along, I reach out for a banister. Is it here? Is it here? Is it here? Where is it? It's like right here, right? Doesn't it feel like about right? Kinda-ish, right? So right here on me, I'm almost 6 feet tall. So I'm going to say right here, maybe it's like 4 feet. But anyway, if I had boobs, which I do have, so if I had, anyway, I shouldn't even begin to go down that road. I'm wearing a really tight t-shirt now. It's a t-shirt I should have thrown away ages, never mind. See why, no. So anyway, it's like a right lower part of my rib cage is where I'm feeling like, or a little bit above my waist, but kind of like right in this area. Does that feel like right? So that's where I need to put it for her. So I'm looking at this. She's still a little bit tall. If I'm saying it should be, close to her waist part, I got to bring her down just a little bit more, and that's feeling a little bit more right for me. So she's actually scaled correctly in this space right now. So I can zoom back out a little bit. You guys can, I'm going to zoom back out a little bit. Once I've got her scaled, I'm going to go ahead and say okay to this. She's scaled correctly in this space, but this isn't where Lily had actually put her figure. Lily's figure was much closer to this statue part. When you've got a person, remember, I can move her left or right and she will not change in size. The only reason she changes in size is if she comes closer to the camera, she gets bigger. If she goes further away from the camera, she gets smaller. For me, I would probably leave and work my composite right where I am at right now because I love the idea that she's near this staircase. I might be able to do something with puppet warping in that foot to actually get it up on that staircase, on that step, so it looked like that's where I would play the game. But that's not where Lily actually did. She had her figure more here in the front part of it. The real problem we've got with this is that to find my vanishing point for this, I can find the horizon line for this. To do that, hit the P key to get the pen tool. And what we're going to do is we're going to use the girders that are actually on the top here to actually get to find my horizon point, the vanishing line and the horizon point. So I'm going to click right in the middle of this girder right here, and I'm going to pull a line down. And again, I'm moving it back and forth so that the line stays right in the center of that girder. And I'm going to put another point down here at the bottom. Then I'm going to come up to the top, and I'm just going to set a point pretty far out of my way over here because I don't want it to get confusing with these other lines. Then I'm going to go after this girder right here. I'm going to set a point right in the middle of it. And again, drag this line down and move it back and forth until that line, my pin line, goes right in the middle of that girder. And I'm going to click on that and say OK. Where these two come together is my horizon line. So I'm going to click and drag this down. I just pulled a guide out from my ruler, and that's where the horizon line actually is on this. Now we've got a bunch of path lines on here that we don't need, so click on your path palette, throw that work path away. It's done its job. This line up here is the horizon line. However, if you look at the line that actually came from Lily originally, this is really pretty much where the true horizon line of this girl is on her figure, not in this scene. So I am wildly out of perspective in this, and there is no way that I'm actually going to be able to get that part back. What I do know about perspective when we looked at it in the beginning, though, is that typically the distance above her head relative to the background remains consistent if the girl is in perspective, or if any figure is in perspective. So in order to change her in perspective, the first thing I'm going to do is move her more into the center of my frame. So I'm going to hit the B key to get the move tool. Make sure that you are working on the girl. I'm going to hold down the shift key so that when I click and drag her to the right, she does not move up or down. She'll stay anchored on the floor. So you can see the amount of room that she has relative to that blue tile that's actually behind her. It's a plaque that's actually behind her. I need her, if she is in perspective, no matter how close or far away she comes from my camera, you will still see that very same amount of blue tile above her head. She will never grow and cover the top of that. So to do that, I'm going to hit Command T to transform the girl. I'm going to drag my anchor point so that it sits right on the very top of her head. Now, even though this is not going to ever be in perspective, it couldn't be unless I went and rephotographed the girl or re-photographed the Art Institute. This is hopefully going to be as good of an illusion as we can get out of this. I'm going to back out now just a little bit. My anchor point is where I want it, what I would call my artificial horizon line. Hold down the Shift key and the Option key, and then simply click and drag this forward to bring her forward and make her larger. So I would continue, if we take a look at the bottom of your frame, personally I would continue. I like the idea of this sort of statue that's in the middle here. If we outlined the statue and actually had the statue cover part of the girl, it would anchor her more into the space. All those sorts of things, that's what I would try to do in here. But I want to continue to work on these and get a few more done. So instead, I'm going to still hold down the Shift key and the Option key. I'm going to push her back a little bit so she's more right in the middle of that space. So she's right sort of in the middle of that square relative to the stairs. And I'm going to go ahead and say OK to that. So scale-wise, I'm happier where she is. I believe where she is. I need to get rid of all the guidelines that we've got. So up to the View menu, down to Guides, down to Clear Guides. And I'm going to run my check layers. So over to Actions, run your check layers, turn off the color to begin with, scroll down and turn on your luminosity check layer. And when we take a look at this, it doesn't seem too far off. She seems, again, too contrasty for me for this big space. However, what we haven't done, I'm going to turn that luminosity check layer off. I haven't checked for how good Lily's exposure of the Art Institute is. So if you click on the background layer, you will notice that it is not a smart object. Now, I'm okay with that. I wouldn't be okay if you shot this, because in that case it should be a RAW file, but if it isn't, or for some reason you did it off your phone or whatever, it doesn't matter. We can actually still affect all the tools that we use for smart objects. So to do that, first off, we need to convert this to a smart object. To do that, so I've selected my background layer, the Art Institute itself, up to the layer menu, down to Smart Objects, Convert to Smart Object. This is now a smart object. I can now run the Camera Raw filter on it. So again, I've turned it into a smart object, up to the filter menu, down to Camera Raw filter. Now, this is not working on raw data, but this is all the same controls that you get working on this kind of file stuff. So I'm looking for something in here that I could actually consider to be a white point, something that I could actually pull this off of. I don't trust the labels that are on the background wall. I think that those probably are a cream label. But if I look at this guy that's actually right down here, there's some note down here that I feel like it's on the wall. I'm feeling like that actually might be white. So I'm going to see what it looks like. I'm going to grab my white balance tool and I'm simply going to click on that guy, and you'll see that it pulls in a whole lot of coldness to this. To see the before and after, simply click on this. At this stage of the game, the warmer version of this is the way that I feel about the Art Institute. But again, I think it's probably going to be easier to balance these two if I do the true white balance on this, although I'm not sure I trust the white balance. So I'm going to look at the whatever these things are up on the ceiling. Oh, these are much better in terms of what my color white balance is, because I know that these are those can lights that actually should be white. So I'm going to white balance on one of these instead. And that brings back in a considerable amount of that warmth. So now I'm feeling like this is going to be color balanced. Again, I'm going to hit my auto button to see what changes in exposure actually happen. You see it brought things down a little bit. It brought my exposure slightly down. Things got a little bit richer. They also got a little bit sharper. So I'm happier with the way this thing looks now. So I'm going to go ahead and say okay to that. If you want to see the real difference in that, just hit Command Z back and forth. And I feel like this is actually working better, a little bit more interesting. So now I'm going to turn on my luminosity check layer. The one thing that I do know about her, I think her exposure is right, but again, those shadows are way too deep. She is in this gigantic light space, skylights, gigantic skylights up there. There's light bouncing all around. There's light bouncing up off of that floor. She's way too contrasty. So select the girl, select the composite of her, up to the image menu, down to adjustments, down to shadows and highlights. And at this stage of the game, I think that 35 is actually correct. It lifted it up, and that looks far more believable to me where she is in this space. You might even consider lifting it even more. I'm going to turn off the check layer, and that feels pretty good here. Again, I've got a color imbalance, so I need to fix that. I'm going to turn, again, I don't think I need to lift this anymore, so I'm going to go straight to turning on my color check layers. And again, this is back to the same old issue that we've got. We're going to go through these. We're not going to throw shadows on it because it seems like we're doing the same thing over and over and over again. And I want to get onto some other things. So I'm going to add color balance to this guy. And I'm going to do the standard that we've been doing all along. I'm going to pull up the yellows in here. I'm going to also pull up a little bit of the magenta here. Not that much. Possibly a little bit more of the yellow. Turn off my colors, check layers to see what I did. And this is the difference, turning this on and off. It needs to be clipped to my scene. It also needs to have its blending mode changed to color. And that part's actually working for me. And then finally my saturation check layer. And I know, look at how much she stands out relative to everyone else. That's never going to work. So again, with my curve, my color layer that's on here, I'm going to add a hue saturation layer above that. Clip it so that it only impacts the girl. Change the blending mode to saturation. And then pull the saturation down. Turn off the saturation check layer. And this is where I'm at right now. I'm going to double click on the hand. Do a history snapshot of this. And this is where we were. Giant girl. I'm guessing, I don't know, 10, 12, 15 feet tall. And correct girl. Are we good on this part? Are you guys okay with doing this? For me, I would have killed to do this. Is this whole process helping sort of like reinforce all of this? This is the last part that we do about compositing, so I'm really trying to drive this home as much as I can. So hopefully you guys are okay with this. I'm going to close this girl up. We're going to go to the very next one. If I feel like we're running out of time and I'm looking for something a little bit more interesting, we'll go for it. But actually this one of Lauren's I thought was actually pretty well done. So let's take a look at it and see if we can't see basically what's going on in here. She's got some saturation. There's some check layer stuff that's actually going up in here. I'm going to get rid of all of that just to start clean. So I've selected the luminosity check layer. I'm going to select the whole group and simply delete it. Then I'm going to open up her color, light, and matching part, whatever here. She has shadows here. The problem with her shadows here is that they're actually on top of the figure. They should be underneath the figure. So for the time being, I'm going to see what else she's got going on in here. We're going to turn off. Actually, I'm going to throw that entire group away because it's all shadows and control layers. Although I've got to say, if you take a look at this right off the bat, this is actually really incredibly close. You know, I mean, I thought that this part was actually amazingly close. I just want to see what it looks like unmodified for me. So I'm just going to throw that whole group away. And that got rid of the shadows as well. She has also added shadows underneath here. And I'm just going to turn that group on and off. And I love what you did here in terms of obliterating that part. It makes that seem more believable to me. And in some ways, that might be the only shadow that she actually needs. So that part I actually thought was done pretty right. She does have the correct figure in here. You can see it's a pretty bright side light coming over here. You can see the both sides that are in shadows, the both sides that are the highlight parts here that are not in shadows, whatever. All of that part's actually working out really well. So I'm going to leave her added shadows that are underneath that. I am going to double click on her boat, the harbor layer, just to sort of see what's going on in here. This gets tricky in terms of trying to do a color balance on this because we basically have sunset, which is a warm light, and I don't really believe that this boat over here is actually white to begin with. But you've also got the shadow side of all of this, which is getting all of this blue sky and this blue water is filling in these shadows. So these shadows are incredibly blue and should be incredibly blue. So I'm going to zip into here and see if I can't find something else that I think might be a cleaner white. Maybe the top edge of this boat might be. I sort of like the warmth, though, that she's got going on in here, but I'm just going to check to see what happens if I change that color balance based on that. And it doesn't impact, oh, it actually impacts this quite a bit. And this, to me, ruins the mood of all of this, so I'm going to hit Command-Z to undo that. We're going to leave it where it is right now. However, I am going to check what Photoshop thinks her exposure should be, so I'm going to click on Auto. And you can see it brightened up the sky in the background a little bit. That's not enough for me to actually accept it, so I'm going to keep it a little bit moodier. It opened up the leaves a little bit. Well, I take that back. Let me see this one more time. It's actually opening up the leaves here a little bit, and I think that that's maybe a better call for us because the shadow side of the girl is relatively open. It's not blocked up. If we undo this, this whole area up here of the leaves is too blocked up. So I am going to go with the slightly brighter version of this and say OK. Because I feel like that's going to actually fit her a little bit better. I'm going to then click on her body and run our check layers. and turn off the color ones and start with luminosity. And I'm going to zip back out. So when I'm looking at the luminosity part of this, and I'm looking at how white that light's hitting that boat, and I've got to believe that light's hitting her just as hard. She seems a little on the dark side to me. So I'm going to lift her up to make her, the contrast is right. I'm looking at the contrast on the sides of the boat. I don't think I need to lift the contrast, the shadow of her, but overall she needs to be brightened up. So I'm going to click on her body so that when I add a layer, it'll be right on top. I am going to add a curve. I'm going to change the blending mode of that curve to luminosity because that's all we're trying to do is change, we don't want to change anything but that. I am going to clip it, holding down the Option key and clicking on the area right between the two curves. And then again, I'm not trying to lift my midtones. I'm trying to lift the exposure of everything. So to do that, you grab the white point slider and start to drag it to the left. And I'm looking again, I'm really looking at the highlights of these two boats over here and the highlight on her face. To give yourself a before and after, there's an eyeball at the bottom of your properties panel. You can turn this on and off. And that seems to have more that vibe that I'm seeing on the side of the boat from a lighting point of view. So I'm going to turn off my luminosity check layer and take a look at this. And the difference in the two, this actually seems to strike me more as sunlight. The problem that I have though is that I'm now feeling like the highlight side is right, but I'm feeling like the shadow side is too blocked up. This shadow that's actually happening on this side would not be this blocked up. So I need to open those shadows up. I'm going to turn my luminosity check layer back on. I'm going to select the body so that I can use a smart filter to lift that shadow up to the image menu, down to adjustments, down to shadows and highlights. In this case, it's lifting them way too much, so I'm going to grab my amount slider for the shadows and start to drop it back down to a place that I feel like makes a little bit more sense. And so I'm around a 15. If you use your preview check mark on and off, this feels to me more like the way this girl would be outside with all this light bouncing around. So I'm going to go ahead and say okay to that. Turn off my luminosity check layer. And this feels a little bit better to me. Again, I think the color's off, but I think the luminosity on this part's actually looking pretty good to me. So maybe we've lifted her a little too much. I'm going to go back to that curve, and I'm going to back off a little bit of that added exposure. And that feels a little bit better. Yeah. So then we're going to go up and turn on our color check layers. You can see there's a massive mismatch in this part. So again, I'm going to click on, this is my luminosity adjustment layer. I'm going to add a color balance layer on top of this. I'm going to change the color balance layer to a color blending mode. I'm going to clip it to the girl so it's only her. Now in this case, I need to fight some of that. I got a lot of blue going on in here, so I'm going to pull some of this yellow out. I'm going to grab my yellow slider and push it towards the blue. And you'll see it starts to bring in more sort of like, it's bringing in a lot of sort of like reddish maroony tones in her face. So it may not only be blue, it actually might be a cyan push as well. And as I start to push in that cyan, you can see I'm starting to pick up some of the same notes that are happening on the boat. So I'm feeling a little bit better about this. This is the difference. I'm just going to turn this on and off. It's, I think, pushing things more in the direction of this sort of like bluish area. I'm going to turn off my color layers to see if I was correct about that. And this is what my color check layer actually did. And I believe this much more. It sucked out a lot of that a red that was actually in here. She may need to be warmed up a little bit right now. So to do that, next great trick. She actually is a smart object that's based on raw data. So if you double click her to open up the smart object, you'll see what happens is it actually opens up another file that's got the green screen version of her in here. If you double click on the green screen version of her, you go into Camera Raw. And inside of Camera Raw, I can use the color temperature slider to warm her up. So I was at 4450. I would actually write that down so that if this goes horribly wrong, I can come back in here and fix it. But I'm going to drag that color temperature slider slightly up to warm her up a little bit. So I went up to 5100. I'm going to say okay to that. I'm going to close this up and say save. And now I've actually got the warmer version of her. If you hit Command Z, you go to the less warm, Command Z. This actually now is fitting my whole scene quite a bit more. I'm going to do one last one and do my saturation check layer on here. And you can see her dress is oversaturated relative to everything else that we've got going on in here. So I'm going to lose a little bit of saturation on the dress. I'm going to again come down to the control layers that I'm using. I'm going to click on add adjustment layer and I'm going to add a hue saturation one. I'm going to change its blending mode to saturation. I'm going to clip it down and drop some of the saturation off. Not tons, but some. And then turn off my saturation check layer and see what I've got going on here. And for me, that feels, that's a little too strong. So I'm going to I'm at a negative 24. I'm going to cut it in half and go to a negative 12. Feels better to me. So the last thing that I'm going to do is if you look at this railing right here, this railing would actually, look at what's happening to the railings right here. These railings are throwing shadows across all of these other railings. Railing would be throwing shadow across this part of the image as well. So I'm going to create a shadow that runs across this. Again, anything that I can do to bring in more of a sense of believability in this is what I'm going to do. So I am going to hit the P key to get the pen tool. I'm going to then just sort of draw where I think this shadow would be. So I'm going to start here. I'm going to try to get this point here, the illusion that this point is actually in here. And I'm going to come back this way, make it a little bit wider, come up to here, and that's going to be how I build my shadow. So I'm going to go into my path palette, I'm going to double click it and call it shadow. I'm going to load it as a selection, command click loads it. I'm going to go back to my layers palette. I'm going to then add another luminosity curve on this, so curves. It puts the mask that we just created on the curve. However, if I just do the curve right now, if I just drag this down right now as it is, you can see it's showing it on everything. It goes past that. I only want this to be on the girl itself, so I need to clip this to everything else that's being clipped. So again, I'm going to hold down my option key, hover between these two, click, and it now clips it only to that. It's way too sharp. So if you click on the layer mask itself to make it active, instead of, we can do the feathering here. So I'm going to click on the feathering right here in my properties panel, and I'm going to drag this to soften that up. And that part feels about right. And then I'm going to finally go back to the properties part. I feel like it's a little too dark, so I'm going to lift it back up again. Look at our history palette. I'm going to do a snapshot here. I'll lift it up. This is where things were, and this is where things are now. Are we good? It would really help if you guys would do these with me. Believe me, these are the kind of things that you're not going to want to watch a video of this kind of stuff and hopefully get it. We're going to do one more here out of this group, and this is actually a really interesting one. I thought this was a pretty smart one. It just needs a few changes in it. So it's Caleb's. So what can you tell me about the light in this situation? Depends on where she is. So you're right, it should be overhead where she is right here, but what happens if I pull her forward? Isn't this direct light that's happening right here? Those are the kind of things that I look for to try to take advantage of this. So again, to find the horizon line for her, I'm going to get rid of everything that's also in here above all of this. So I'm going to click on anything that's above her that's controlling all of this, go all the way to the top, hold down the Option key, click, hit the Delete key to get rid of all of that. There are shadows that are on the bottom, but they're not shadows that would be based on the lighting on her, so I'm going to get rid of those as well. The curve that's actually down here is actually bringing in a little bit of contrast into this image. If we take a look at it, yeah, I can't spot. I know, oh, it's actually just darkened up the shadows just a little bit in here. What I'm going to do instead is I'm going to I'm going to select this background. I'm going to convert it to a smart object. Once it is a smart object, I'm going to run camera filter on it, camera raw filter. Do I have something white in this scene that I can white balance on? And I actually do. I'm going to believe that the license plates are indeed white. So I'm going to white balance on the license plate in the back of the motorcycle. It sucks out some of that warmth, but it's a more believable warmth. If I don't like what I just did there, I can also look at the edge of the drywall, because I know that that's also going to be white. So let me zoom in a little bit more on that. And I'm going to click on that part. That sucks out even more. So I think I'm going to go back to the way it was. Bug in Photoshop. And then I'm going to see what auto does on this one. And makes things a little bit darker, brings them down a little bit. It's a little less vivid color than what Caleb actually had going on. So not that I wouldn't be able to work with that part, but again, the more neutral I can get it, the more neutral the girl is. So then I'm going to bring the girl forward. First off, I'm going to turn her off. Oh, there's also still his curve is on here. I'm going to get rid of that because I don't need it. To find out where the converging lines are in here, I don't trust what's happening on the walkway down in here. And the reason I don't trust this part down here is that it's the walkway itself could be curved. The walkway itself could actually undulate up and down. There's nothing about this that I know somebody tried to make level, but I do know that all of the awnings and up here, people have worked to make those things level. So that's what I'm going to base mine off of. I'm going to hit the P key to get the pen tool, and I'm going to click on this board right here, come all the way to the other side and drop a point. Then I'm going to come up over here and I'm going to click on this board right here. Take that back, hang on one second. Take that back. There's a windowsill that's right underneath here. I'm going to click on that guy. And so this is where my horizon line is right here. I'm going to get rid of my path. Double click on the hand, turn the girl back on. Again, that's where the horizon line is. I know that the one on her is really sort of, again, right about where her knees are. So I'm going to do the same trick with her. I need to bring her forward so that I can get her into this direct light. So I'm going to select the girl, hit Command T. I'm going to put the anchor point above her head because, again, I know that if she was in perspective, that I should not lose any of that information that is above her head. Hold down the Shift and the Option key and click and drag her forward so that I know that she would actually be in that area that would be casting light or shadow onto this part. So I've got her scaled in perspective. I'm going to go ahead and say OK to that. Before I build the shadows for her, though, I'm going to run my check layers and do all of that work first. So again, over to the Actions palette, run check layers on her, turn off color, turn on the luminosity check layer. Now what's going on in here is that I've got this wall over here that's basically giant reflector, especially this part right here. So I know that she actually needs to be lifted. The contrast side of her, the shadow side of her, actually needs to be lifted. It's way too dark for this scene. So image menu, adjustments, shadows and highlights. It's actually opened up that side. I think it's a little too much, but not tons. So I'm going to drop it down to a 30. And I'm going to leave it there. And let's see what this looks like without the check layer. That part feels pretty good to me, but she also seems a little bit dark to me if she was in the direct light that was being hit by all of this. So I'm going to, add an adjustment layer, a curve, change its blending mode to luminosity, clip it to the girl, and make her slightly brighter. And that feels more like she's being hit by that sun. I'm going to look at my color. And again, in this case, she's feeling really pretty close to all the coloring that's actually happening in here. So I don't know that there's any color shift that I really need to make on this. I'm sort of believing that part, but I do need to then check the saturation. And the saturation, again, I think her dress is a little too saturated for this whole area. So I am going to add saturation adjustment layer. Change its blending mode to saturation. Clip it. And pull the saturation down. Turn off my saturation check layer. This seems to me to be a believable light that's actually hitting her on this. Now, if we're going to say that the light that's actually hitting this is indeed hitting her face, her shadow would have to be, the shadow of her face would have to be in this light area that's hitting right here. So to build that shadow, again, this is one of those compound shadows that we did last week. So to build the compound shadow, first off, I'm going to click a layer in between. I'm clicking the background layer. I'm going to add a blank layer in between and call it shadow 1. I'm going to command click to load her as a selection, and on my shadow 1, I'm going to fill that with black. In my case, black is my foreground color. Option delete fills that with black. Command D to deselect, and then I'm going to duplicate this shadow because, again, it's a compound shadow. So Command J to duplicate it. I'm going to start with my shadow 2 on the wall. And I'm simply going to drag it onto the wall like this. Now again, this shadow's coming from the side, and this thing is not really to the side. This thing is still facing us frontwise. So I need to distort this a little bit to look like it's more twisted away from me. I'm going to go to my pasteboard first by hitting the F key, because to do any of that sort of work, it actually, my computer hopefully is not getting ready to lose itself in all of this. I need to transform this shadow so that it looks like it's laying more flat against the wall. So again, Command T to transform the shadow. Then I'm going to come up to my transforms, and I'm going to say that this is probably a perspective transform, and we'll see what happens. And that actually seems to work more for me. I'm going to pull this other side down a little bit and drag this up a little bit. So I feel like this arm is too close to her body. So we can actually try to warp this as well. So again, that's the warp transform. And I can start to actually pull this part in, pull this part in, pull this part up. Pull this lower part way in. So that's beginning to feel more like the way that shadow would actually be. I think part of this would come way in as well. And that feels a little bit better to me. I want it to stay all within that light. So I'm just going to pull this down and push this in even more. Wow, my computer is really, really, really unhappy right now. And say okay to that. So it's more like what the side light part of this would actually sort of like be on her. And then again, I can take my other shadow, my number 1 right here, Command T. I need to connect those two. So I'm going to put the anchor point right between her feet. Rotate this shadow down. Drag it way out. Crush it. Set it at her feet again. And say okay to that. And then again, I need to mask all of this off. So I'm going to turn all of that off. Hit the P key to get the pen tool. Get this line drawn, whatever that horizon line is. Load that as a selection. Feather that slightly. I'm going to do 1 pixel. Say okay to that. Come back and turn on this part, the shadow that's going across that, and add a layer mask to that. This mask now needs to be inverted. So now I've got the feet actually going close. I've got this part actually going close. Break the chain link between the two. I need to still transform those feet as they come in more. And you guys get where this whole thing is going. Soften the shadow, blur the shadow. I feel like I'm losing everyone in here, and I'm also losing my computer. But is this making sense where we're going through in all of this? I'm going to finish this up really quickly. I would do far more work on this shadow to make it actually believable, but to sort of get it to be the part where it needs to be before I completely lose my computer, I'm going to turn off everything except for the shadows. Both of my shadows are visible. I'm selecting the top one, holding down Command, Option, Shift, and the letter E, which actually does a merge stamp version of them. So I can turn off both of these. I'm going to then load that merge stamp version of this. Command click to load it as a selection. And then I'm going to add a curve. And that will mask my curve so then I can turn the shadow off. I'm going to turn everything else back on. I'm going to turn my background on. I'm going to turn the girl on. My correction layers on. And then on my curve right now, I'm looking at the other shadows that are happening in here and sort of what's going on. There's a shadow that's happening right here on this wall that's being caused by this. Hang on 1 second, let me see if I can stop this. So I've got a curve on here that I can use to recreate the shadow part if you take a look at that. But the shadow that she's casting on here would be the same color as the shadow on the wall. So I'm going to drop this curve down just so that I can see where it is. I'm going to put down 2 color points. I'm going to put one right here in the shadow and one right here above that's also in shadow being created by the building. Those two actually need to match. So if I look at my readouts right up in here, I can see that this number 1 right here, I've already made it too dark. The number 1 numbers, these after numbers right here, need to equal these before numbers right here. So my red needs to be a 153, so I'm going to bring this up till I see that red at 153. So my red channel is now matching this. My green channel, though, is still a little too hot. It needs to be 129, not 143. So I'm going to go to my green channel and drag it down till it reads 129. And then finally, my blue channel needs to read 96. And now her shadow right here is identical in color to the shadow that's on the wall up here. There's a weird overlap of shadows right here because again, I'm actually creating the shadow that really shouldn't be. So I'm going to go back into my curve. I've selected the curve and I'm going to transform it again. I'm going to warp it again. And I'm just trying to get the overlap of that out of the way. So I'm just going to pull it in more like that and say, okay. Hide this. I'm going to do a color snapshot of this. Oh, actually, I can't do a color snapshot of this. So I'm going to open Caleb's original one. And I'm going to flatten my image. Drag it on top of Caleb's. Oh, come on. And so this is our before and after. But I have to say, Caleb, it started out really pretty strong. Makes sense to you guys? All right, I'm going to look to see if we have anything special that we can really look at that we haven't sort of gone over. And other than that, we're going to call it a day. I think I've composited you guys to death. Oh, come on. Yeah, let's do one last one, guys. This will be a more extreme one, but let's try one last one. So if you look inside one of the folders that I sent you, that folder 9.1, There's one that Jordan actually did of a girl in the middle of the street. If you can double click on that one, this will be the last one that we actually go through. I'm going to get rid of these guidelines because this covers a lot of the other stuff that we've been sort of talking about. I'm going to get rid of these guidelines, view menu, down to guides, down to clear guides. I'm also going to get rid of all the layer work that he's actually done on here. So he's got some shadow stuff that's underneath. I'm simply selecting all of those and deleting it. He's got really weird, the way he tried to control contrast on the top was he's got these layers of white. So I'll show you what one looks like. He's got like these discs of white that he's putting on top of people and then dropping the opacity of it. I have no idea what that's about. That's a horrible YouTube video he watched. So I'm going to put the girl back on in here, and what can you tell me about this scene, lighting-wise? Overhead light again, right? What's the light on the girl? Fucking side light. Wrong girl. Again. Wrong girl. So I'm throwing her away. I'm throwing away the check layer. I'm throwing away all the curves. I'm throwing away everything except for the background. So if you guys want to start in the same place, that would be great. Before I do anything, I'm going to see if this thing has been exposed and color balanced correctly. To do that, I'm going to change this into a smart object. So layer, smart objects, convert to smart object. Up to the filter menu, down to camera raw filter to open this up. I know that the little lines on the streets actually are painted in white paint, so that's something that I can color balance on, and so I'm gonna click on the white balance tool and click on one of those white parts. It actually brings a lot of blue into this, which is okay. If I want to then put the girl in there, put them together and warm the whole thing up as a color grade, I can do that. But it's much easier to have this be neutral as well as the girl be neutral. I'm going to zip back out on this and run auto to see what that actually does to the scene. It brightens it all up. I love what it does to the lights. It introduces a little bit more flare in there. That part actually works for me. So I'm going to go ahead and say okay to that. You can see it's a pretty serious shift in all of this. I'm going to then open up the comp number 2. Because that's the girl in black. I'm going to drag her body onto this, hold down the shift key and let go. Say okay to the warnings, doesn't really matter. So then I've got to look for something in my scene that I believe I know how tall it actually is. What in this scene do you guys know? Can you look at and say, oh, I know about how tall that really is? You betcha. The bike thing, right? So, everybody stand up again. Where does the bike thing go to? Is it here? Is it about here? It's sort of like pocket level. Yeah, everybody kind of feels good at crotch level, right? I mean, for lack of a better way of putting it. Would you guys agree with that sort of? So, let's scale her based on her crotch. So, first off, before we do anything, I want to find the vanishing point of this scene. So again, I've got some pretty good lines here to be able to actually do that part with. So I'm going to hit the P key to get the pen tool. I'm going to start and I'm going to do the road, or you know, the sort of the curb. So that's my one line there. This is my other line here. And where those two intersect is the horizon line. And I can throw away my path. I don't need that anymore. Back into my layers palette, I'm going to turn the girl on. Command T. Again, she's a smart object, so I don't need to worry about destructive transforming. I'm going to click on the link between width and height, and then I'm going to shrink her down. If you shrink somebody down below 0, they invert, they flip upside down. I'm going to move her back over to the bike path, or to the, the bike rack. I'm going to continue to shrink her down. can't, it's just gone. My computer's going absolutely haywire. Let's try this again. Command T, width and height. I'm going to put her right up next to this bike path. She's got to be made smaller still. She is now scaled right for the bike path part. So then I'm going to just slide her straight to the left, holding down the shift key so that she comes back out into the middle of the street. And in this case, again, I know that the horizon line is below her, but this scene itself is probably abstract enough that I should be able to transform her and get her back up into scale. So I'm going to leave the anchor point exactly where it is, because it's a little bit below the horizon line of the street, but a little bit above the horizon line of her. Hold down the shift key and the option key and simply drag her forward in space. We'll bring her all the way up to here. And I'm going to double click on the hand to actually, so this is where I think she should actually be. Just as a point of reference, I'm going to see how different we are in scale from where it was before. I'm going to snapshot this just where it is and then go back and take a look at what Jordan had actually done. And you can see that the girl that he put in there is 2.5 feet tall. Did anybody pick up on that when we were looking at it to begin with? Right? So then again, we're off to the very same thing that we've been doing all along. We're going to actually run our check layers on this. First off, I'm going to get rid of the guide. Then we'll run our check layers. Turn those guys off. Start off with our luminosity check layer. Yeah.
When I do my check layers, it makes me take through each and every step.
No, that's not. So let's take a look at that right after. So wait, let's just take a look at it right now. Go back in history to undo all that.
Yeah,
So, let me see what the bell is. So when you click on that, just click on the run part. That's the wrong side. So if you go to our server really quick. Let's get rid of the one that we have. So click on that layer. So try to control clicking on that display side. Or just click on the set. And then click on the slot menu. So you can delete that slide. Just go ahead and collapse it. Oh, I know, wait. Load. Okay, cool. So yeah, if you want to get rid of all of that stuff and run it once. So anyway, when I'm looking at this, again, she seems way too bright in this scene for me. So I'm going to add a curve on top of her. Change its blending mode to luminosity. Clip it to her so that it only impacts her. and then simply grab the white point and drag it down. Again, this is an overall exposure move. And that feels a little bit better to me right now, so we'll sort of see what that looks like. It feels a little bit better given our scene and our situation right here. Let's see what our color looks like. So turn on the color check layers. And in this case, everything except her face is actually working pretty well for me in terms of this. That whole background has got all of that blue in it. There's a lot of that. So I don't know how far off she is. She's got a little bit too much red in her face, so I am going to go after just her face. We'll see if we can't get rid of a little bit of that. So again, with my luminosity check layer, luminosity control layer, adjustment layer, whatever is highlighted, I'm going to add a color balance to this. I'm going to clip it. I'm going to change the blending mode of that to color. And then again, it's got too much red here, so it's this red cyan version of this. I think I need to push that a little further, and I also need to push my yellow into the blues a little bit more. That's certainly getting the outfit closer to this color, and I can possibly go after the magentas a little bit as well, although not that much. And we'll see what this looks like without the curve on here. Sorry. Those are the adjustment layers without the check layer on. And that feels a little bit better to me now. This is what I've actually done. It sucked out a lot of that red, which I feel like it really needed to do. I'm gonna check my saturation really quick. And the saturation part has come down as well. So I like all of that part. So this part seems to be working pretty well for me. I'm gonna double click on the hand to kick back out. I actually am all the way out. What I'm missing about this though is that look at all the flare that's happening with all of these lights. She is like way too sharp in here for my money. So if we go down to her again, she's a smart object. I'm going to double click on this smart object to open it up. Inside here is the smart object of the raw file. I'm going to double click on that to go into camera raw. And now I can actually introduce what we would basically consider to be flare. So right now, we've got a clarity slider that actually makes things sharper. I actually want things softer, so I'm going to do a negative clarity on this and sort of see what happens. I'm really going to push it down. And I take that back. Let me see one more thing in here really quick. Hang on one second. Yeah, we don't have it in this version of, you can see this little triangle right down here. This file was actually developed with an older version of Camera Raw. If you want to see which one it actually is, it is, oh, here under calibration. If you open this up, it will tell you that this was processed with version 2. We are now on version 5. So I'm going to change this to version 5 because there's controls in the basic panel that I want to get to. So I'm going to click on this little that little warning triangle part right there. If you click on it, this now has upgraded this to the most recent version. Again, if you look at it, it's saying version 5 is current right now. Now inside the basic panel, you have a haze filter. So in this direction, we'll actually remove haze. In the negative direction, creates haze. And so I'm going to do it like at a 41 or around a minus 30, something like that. And I'm going to click OK to this. I didn't touch the clarity once I went to that other one. And I'm going to go ahead and say OK to that and save these changes. And now you can see that the girl has got this like haze on her. So if we do Command Z to undo it, too sharp, Command Z again to do this, it makes it believe a little bit, I believe this a little bit more. The last thing that I would do for this is, again, all of my lighting is really overhead, which means the lower part of her would be darker than it is right now. So to do that, we're going to do one last thing. So I'm coming up to all of my layers on here. I'm going to add a blank layer on top of all of that. I am going to clip that to the figure, to everything else that's going on. I'm going to hit the B key to get a brush. I'm going to make sure it is a completely soft brush. And I'm going to make sure that the brush is large enough that the top of the brush touches pretty much her waist and the middle of the brush is at her shoes. So that part feels about right, although my computer is still catching up. So again, the center of this at her feet, the edge of it sort of at her, maybe just below her waist, just below her bust line. On that one layer, I'm simply going to, again, normal blending mode, 100% opacity, 100% flow. I'm going to click once. It makes everything in here way too dark, so I'm actually going to then see what my blending modes will give me. I'm going to try multiply. That's not really helping me. I'm going to try overlay. They're all still way too dark, so I'm going to go back to normal and then just drop the opacity down on this. I'm going to do one more of them down by her feet. I'm going to make, again, a second layer, clip it still. Smaller. So it hits about her knees. And none of this has been clipped, so hang on. Oh, that's why. And again, drop the opacity back on this enough that it doesn't look just black in there. So you can see where we're beginning to go with this. I'm not going to keep killing you guys to death on this, but this will do, again, a history snapshot of where we are. First, let's do one quick shadow and we'll call it a day. So again, I'm clicking on the background because I want this to be between the two. I'm going to add a new layer. Hit the G key to get the gradient tool. It's still going from foreground to transparency. It's still a circular gradient. Click and drag it out. Command T to do a transform. Hold down the Option key. Pull this down. Bring it down under her feet. This is what I meant about that whole... Oh, that's because I'm still holding down the Option key. Make it narrower. Go ahead and say OK to that. Hit the E key to get the eraser tool. Erase all of that. The V key to actually move it a little more centered here. Command T, drag it out a little bit more. E key to get the eraser tool. Drop the opacity down a little bit. Anyway, so clearly there would be more work to do on this. We'll do this as snapshot number 2. And so this is where it started, and this is where we are right now. Make sense? Questions about any of this? All right. I think that's a part of it. Okay, there's one last thing that I did want to show you though, and this one will go really quick. It's in the artificial ones because it's the last thing we haven't really talked about. If you can look inside those same folders, but inside 9.2, there's one in here. Actually, let's do Jordan's. No, let's not do Jordan's. Let's do Ryan's. If we double click on it, this will go really quick. I just want to show you guys one thing. Promise this will go quick. No check layers involved. So in this case, what we've basically got is a scenario where the shadows are wrong, because if you really looked at the shadow that was on her face, there would be a long shadow coming out here from the side. So we need to fix that part. But if you also look at the light that's on the background, it does not match the light that's on her. The light that's on the background is flat. It's really hard to change the light on figures. It's easier to change the light on backgrounds, and that's the only reason I wanted to show you guys this part. So that's what we're going to do, and then we'll call it a day. So if you take a look at his, he's actually been very smart. He's got the blur filter that's on here to sort of create that sense of depth of field. All of those things are working for him. However, I want to actually make this whole background darker, but in the same way to explain the lighting that's actually on her face. So to do that, I'm going to go underneath the shadow. So I'm going to click between the floor and the thing that's marked as shadows number 1. And we're simply going to add a curve on top of that. And I'm going to change the blending mode of this curve to multiply. And it makes everything darker. That's just what it does on the background. So that's not really helping me in the end. What I need is that gradation to go from lighter on one side to darker on the other side. So to do that, hit the G key again to get a gradient. We need to change the type of gradient from that foreground to transparency back to its original foreground to background, black to white. We also need to make sure it's a linear gradient, not a regular gradient. Black is now my foreground color, which means if I use it on this layer mask, it's going to hide that darkening effect. And then wherever it's white, it's actually going to let that come through. So working on the layer mask of that gradient, I'm simply going to start right next to her, and I'm going to click and drag left to right and let go. And you can see it puts in a pretty strong demarcation line in here. Probably a little too strong because my line is a little too short. So I'm going to make it a little bit longer and drag it out a little bit longer, and that sort of softens it up. But it still doesn't make this as intense as it should be to explain the light that's on the girl. So simply duplicate this layer by hitting Command J. And now you can actually feel like this is beginning to approach it. I think this is a little too much. This is a little too strong. So I'm simply going to drop the opacity slider of this back a little bit. And this now becomes far more believable in terms of matching the lighting to the background than it was when we started. Again, we'll just do a quick snapshot of this and take a look at the difference. And you can see it makes a world of difference in terms of the believability. Are we good on that part? Alrighty guys, I've tortured you enough. We're gonna call it a day. I hope everybody has a great, safe holiday, and I will see you guys next week. The way it's